Thank you, David. Good morning, all of you. Good morning, guys. How are you today? Good. All right. It's wonderful to have you here. Hey, thanks for joining us. Here we go. On all fours. Great. We're going to have a service here today where we're going to be telling stories. Do you like stories? Yeah. Yeah. Now, do you like stories that are make-believe stories? What kind of stories do you like if it's not make-believe? You like biographies, and why? Rose, why is that? Why do you like biography? Because you learn about people. Great. In fact, stories about facts are a great way to remember things more vividly than just having to memorize history or the stories of other people's lives. Let me give you a quick example. 2 weeks ago, I did a service here for all the grown-ups. It was about the history of this church, because we are 125 years old. And so, Only what?
She's only 8.
You're only 8, yeah. So 125 seems, yeah. And I'm only 21, and so 125 seems enormous. So what happened was I did a sermon on the history of 1891, all the things that were happening when this church started. And people after the service said, "Oh, that was very, very interesting. And thank you for doing all that research. And oh, that was really good." But if I asked anyone today if they could remember one fact that I mentioned 2 weeks ago, it wouldn't happen. People like to remember the stories about what happened in history. And so today we're going to have some storytellers that's sitting right there on the first pew. And some of the stories, they remember stories, some of them going back about 75 years, but they remember it because it was in story form. If they read about it in a book, it'd be gone the next day. So stories are crucial. And it's a good way to learn about history. We're going to light the chalice and get our service underway. And Becky, are you going to be the chalice lighter this morning? Wonderful. Come on. After you, madam. Okay, so what we're going to use, you light it from here on the candle. And put that in the light from the, yeah. You got it? Perfect. Wow. You did that far better than I did in the first service. It took me half an hour to light the chalice this morning. Okay. So we're going to step on up and repeat the words after me. Symbol of light.
Symbol of light.
Symbol of knowledge.
Symbol of knowledge.
Symbol of warmth and freedom.
Symbol of warmth and freedom.
We light this chalice
We light this chalice.
as a symbol of our faith.
We light this chalice as the symbol of our faith.
Here we gather to celebrate hope
Here we gather to celebrate hope
and the infinite possibilities of love.
and the infinite possibilities of love.
Becky, thank you. That's perfect. Let us turn to our hymn book, number 38, to begin the service. Morning Has Broken.
Thank
Let's take a moment, find a break in our overly scheduled lives to just sit here in this historic church, a time to think and reflect, also a chance to not only take this bit of alone time during our reflection time, but also to rejoice in just being together in the company of one another. So let us unite our minds and our hearts in the spirit of prayer and meditation and reflection. O Spirit of life and love, we as a congregation stand in awe of the 125-year history of established progressive religious voice in Salt Lake City. The church began with vision and hope and love and imagination. And these elements remain vital to the life of this congregation today as we ponder the future. What rich blessings have been ours for 125 years. So many gifts, so many blessings, so many riches amidst the turmoil of historic events that have known war and bitterness and suffering. We have always been and will continue to come together as a fellowship of seekers who bring activist hearts to an unjust world. We have always found the strength and the courage to meet the challenges of a liberal congregation in the midst of historic trends that have failed to care for those who live on life's margins, powerless, aching for basic human rights. We pause this hour to recall the talents and gifts given us by our forebears, and also to recognize the gifts we presently receive from our peers in this congregation. We know the world awaits the work of our minds and muscles and spirit, and we endeavor to reach our goals and honor our ideals. During these past 125 years, we have learned to cultivate a steadfastness to truth and a commitment towards deeds of justice. May the possibilities, the promises, the hopes that have always been the fabric of this congregation continue to ignite our spirit and carry us forth with new strength. May we walk from here out into the future carrying our history proudly and keeping our tradition of caring for this world deeply in our hearts. Amen. As part of our church's 125th anniversary celebration, I've asked a couple of longtime members of this church to help me in sharing some of the old stories that pertain to this religious institution, stories that can bring us in touch with the untold story of our history. Stories actually connect us to history, as though letting newcomers in on an inside scoop. Families, for example, are often reticent to disclose funny and embarrassing stories or painful and tragic stories as though they are guarding a secret. But when they finally do reveal incredible stories from the past, you know you're in. You feel more as a part of the family because you heard finally about Aunt Matilda getting a little tipsy one night 26 years ago, falling into the pool, and all the fuss that created. And you become acquainted with the family history, and bingo, you're in. Institutions, especially human institutions like churches, can strengthen connections with storytelling. The stories you're going to hear this morning go beyond the facts. Stories will reveal something about who we are, and it's about time we all get on the same page here as new and old members coming together in this church. The service this morning is our humble attempt to bring the newcomers, the new wave of religious liberals trying to make this place their religious home, bring the newcomers into the family, the long-established family. Once you know some of the stories that make this place seem a little quirky, you're bound to feel more at home here. You become part of the church culture. It becomes easier to belong and call this church your home because you know the stories. And every storyteller this morning has been here a lot longer than I. I arrived in 1987. Just as Alan Coombs is relinquishing his chairmanship of the Board of Trustees. Tim Chambless, another storyteller, has been here many years before I and had a very successful run of 20 years or so running the Summer Forum. Barbara Kreek, another storyteller, goes back further in this church than any of the storytellers, and her memories are vivid and they're just wonderful to hear about this church's culture, even in the pre-war times. And Hugh Gillian was minister in this church during the tumultuous 60s. When I first arrived in this church, I still recall a lovely evening I had with my predecessor, Dick Henry, who invited Hugh and his wife Jan up to his house in Ogden, and I got initiated by them. They just told me wonderful stories about this church. And it was just a great way for me to begin my ministry back in 1987. Stories were the key. So I hope that after today's storytelling service, you will feel initiated here, finally, initiated into the vibrancy of this church culture, feel a real part of it, and perhaps you will become storytellers for the next wave of new people coming in, exploring this church as their religious home.
Good morning. I'm Tim Chambless. In December 1979, I entered this church for the first time. I came here for a funeral, officiated by Reverend Dick Henry. As I looked around, I saw 3 friends I knew from the community, from the university, all in various different worlds. Alan Coombs, Flo Weinreiter, and Diane Bradford. I went home. My wife, Kathy, asked me about how the funeral had gone. I told her, and she said, "We're going." And so in January 1980, we started attending weekly this church. We've been members for about 36 years. Our son Ross, our daughter Dominique, grew up in this church. Very proud of them. I mentioned to Dick Henry that I had a little bit of time on my hands. Before I knew it, I was the pledge chair. I told Reverend Henry that I was willing to do just about anything in this church, except I always wanted to be present for the sermons. The sermons were really important to me. I grew up in an evangelical tradition in Texas. So over the years, I served in various capacities. On the board a couple times. I was the judge at the Halloween carnivals. Every child was a winner. And I also surreptitiously undercover for about 20 years served as Mr. Sun during the winter solstice gatherings. I thought I was in disguise. But what I really, really enjoyed doing for a couple decades was to be chair of the Summer Forum Speaker Series. It was very important to me. And it was in the tradition of 125 years, from 1891 until this year, during the summer, that this church be a gathering place, a progressive, liberal voice for people, concerned citizens to come together and be able to hear, and then during question and answer period, talk about very important public policy issues. Maybe that helped me because I'm addicted to news and information. So it met a need of mine. And over the years, we had many religious figures, Catholic, evangelical, Jewish, Muslim, Episcopal, come and speak to this congregation and to visitors, and office holders, the governor of the state, mayors of the city, congressmen, senators. My late friend Randy Horiuchi came and spoke here. Former Senator Frank Moss. Prominent lawyers, all concerned with issues dealing with civil rights, civil liberties. We spoke about refugees, the need for refugees, their needs, the disabled, the LGBT community, the incarcerated. And Main Street Plaza. When I was on the Planning Commission and a member of this church, this was a gathering place after September 11th, 2001. It was a gathering place to come together and speak after the invasion of Iraq in March of 2003. It was a very, very important place for good people to come together. And very often at the end of each of the summer forums, an individual would come up, introduce himself or herself as a visitor to Salt Lake City, and say, "Reverend Goldsmith, I'm happy to meet you."
I'm Alan Coombs, and I suppose every time I think about the 45 years or so that Margie and I and our family have been associated with this church, my mind quickly flashes to the year that I did serve as board president, 1986-87, the year that Richard Henry retired, and basically was left up to the board to handle things. And before very long, I learned that we had a problem. We had what most people would call a homeless man living in the church basement. He never considered himself homeless. He figured First Unitarian Church was his home. But it was a problem because from time to time, he would emerge from the basement, say in the middle of a Women's Alliance meeting in Elliott Hall. He would emerge looking like the wrath of God and acting plenty weird. Or maybe he would visit Susan Browning, our church secretary and administrator, in her office to her considerable alarm. So the board had to do something. There were potential safety concerns, insurance issues to consider, and at the same time, we didn't want a banner headline in the Salt Lake Tribune reading, "Unitarian Church evicts homeless man." So the board decided finally that it was worth a couple of $100 of the church's very meager budget to relocate David. David was his first name. I won't give you the whole name. And Peter Talley, who was at that point serving as Director of Religious Education, and I were designated to escort David to a room in a modest but reputable West Side hotel where he could reside for at least a couple of months with the church picking up the tab. I think he may have come back a couple of times to visit Susan Browning, but he never really moved back in, and nobody was more relieved of that than I was.
Good morning. Our young family arrived here in Salt Lake Valley in July of 1961, early in the 60s decade. It was also the beginning of my ministry in this church. And we hadn't been here very long when I received a short letter from my predecessor, Harold Scott. When Harold left here, he went to Kennebunk, Maine to resume his ministry there. Just 3 short sentences in his letter. Dear Hugh, I've come back east to die. Don't ever leave the West. And the real kicker, tell all the people there who don't like me that I'm very successful. Well, we've been delighted to follow Harold's advice, and we haven't left the West. The matter of talking to somebody who didn't like him, however, I didn't know anybody who didn't like him, so that wasn't part of my mandate. But if anyone had asked, I would have been happy to say I have it on good account that things are going very well. Harold had a weekly radio program, and as part of that program, he frequently said, "Many people are Unitarians and don't know it." And I think he had a valid point. The decade of the 60s, which is my focus here, proved to be very challenging and very stressful in many ways. It was a decade in turmoil with lasting effects for the country and for our church community. Throughout the decade, a counterculture developed, especially among the young, with alternate lifestyles and values, and notably proliferating recreational drug use. In colleges and universities across the country, there were countless sit-ins and demonstrations. There were horrific race riots in major U.S. cities, with many injuries, deaths, and extensive property damage. At the same time, there were developing civil rights demonstrations, especially in the South, which were meant to be peaceful, but were often met with police and bystander violence. Many Unitarians, including ministers, participated in the marches, and tragically, one of our ministers, James Reeb, was killed. It was an awful time. We will never forget, nor should we, the assassinations of three of our heroes, John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, and Bobby Kennedy in Los Angeles. And I do think something vital went out of each of us with each death. There was a 13-day Cuban Missile Crisis when Russia and China were intent on installing long and short-range nuclear missiles in Cuba, which understandably was met with vigorous confrontation by the U.S. A very real nuclear war was suddenly a possibility, with the whole world holding its collective breath. Russia finally retrieved its missiles, but it was a close call. Throughout the 60s decade, the Vietnam War escalated rapidly with almost 60,000 U.S. casualties and many thousands more injured, with an estimated 3 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians were killed. In addition to the victims of the war, our country was badly divided, especially among the young. Quite understandably, draft-age males were the most vulnerable regarding the war, and an unknown number fled to Canada to avoid joining the armed forces. And as the decade came to a close in 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president with Spiro Agnew as vice president, and I think you know how that worked out.
Good morning. I'm Barbara Kreek, but I'm going to share with you stories and memories from the 30s and 40s when I was Barbara Koch. No relation to the Koch brothers. I've been a part of this Unitarian Church for a long time. Every week I walked the mile from our house on the East Bench along 13th East with my mother and little sister for Sunday school, winter, spring, and fall. Dad joined us for the church service after the Sunday school. In the 30s, our minister was Jacob Trapp, remembered as the Unitarian poet minister. You've surely sung his words to songs in our hymnal. My mother told me how his sermons always sent her home, uplifted in spirit. Our Sunday school worship service was in front of the fireplace on the east wall of a much smaller Elliott Hall. We shared stories and learned the hymnal songs. Sometimes we gave plays on the stage, where today you can watch the service on the TV, on the video screen. In my early teens, I played the piano for the singing. It kept me on my toes at my music lesson, learning new songs every week or so. After the worship service, we rushed upstairs to our classes, Old Testament stories, learning about other religions, and the How Miracles Abound curriculum that helped us see miracles in nature all around us. My favorite class was in 6th grade when Jenny Kennedy taught us about one of the first monotheists, the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. We spent weeks making a chalk mural, Egyptian style, on our classroom chalkboard, and I loved it. Music was always a part of our church. We were one of the rare churches who paid our organists, and we always had quality musicians. I remember one organist, shaped rather like a Humpty Dumpty with a bald head and short legs that stretched to reach the organ pedals. But how he could play. He later became the tabernacle organist, as did two of our later organists, Alexander Schreiner and Robert Kundig, who was in the news recently. The choir raised their voices from seats up in the balcony. And there was a junior choir that sprang into action as angels for our annual Christmas pageant. Some of the traditional celebrations that we enjoy today were part of our church then. The spring Easter egg hunt and egg rolling on the lawn. The church picnic where we gathered in one of the Wasatch Canyons rather than one of the Salt Lake parks. The Halloween carnival that had a scary trip through the darkened upstairs hall for the spook alley run by the high schoolers. And then there was the elegant New England dinner run by that was, let's see, an affair that celebrated our New England Unitarian roots. I remember feeling honored to serve and wash up the dishes. There was no electric dishwasher then. This occasion was arranged by our Women's Alliance, a socially and politically active group that was organized just a year after the Unitarians here in Salt Lake City. The Alliance made many contributions to our church with money they raised, and their legacy is remembered. So you can see that for many years, our Unitarian Church has been a place of community, learning and worshiping for those seeking their own religious path.
Just to be clear, listening to Barbara talk about this church being kind of a stepping stone for organists to make it to the tabernacle. David is not leaving. I make that promise right here. David is not leaving. I came to this church 1987. The Sunday school enrollment, the registration was 65. All those 65 registered, so probably 30 showed up on an average Sunday, and they were all stuffed into the upstairs of the Elliott Hall, very small confines. I didn't know what happened. I was 38 years old. I came with a 7-year-old and 4-year-old in tow, and somehow word got on the street that the Unitarian Church is a place to go if you have young kids. And the religious education program spiked in a year to almost 200 kids, to the point that it was really dangerous. And of course, this chapel was really full. You only had one service. And how to proceed, and of course the answer was to build a new sanctuary. And so our architect that we hired, Max Smith, said, "Oh, this is fantastic. I've always dreamed of building a cathedral." But it didn't happen. So what he did, he mapped out a plan for the whole campus, a new church, keeping this as the crown jewel of the campus, and an RE building, all for, this is $1989, $1 million, and we couldn't afford it. I wish we had that opportunity again. So in our many, many discussions about what to do in terms of safety, we'd be more comfortable here as adults, but the kids were really in jeopardy, so we decided to build an RE building. And where the RE building presently stands, before that, there was a typical Salt Lake bungalow, and we thought it would be pretty easy because we'd have to remove the bungalow. But this is the Douglas Neighborhood Council, were very dead set against losing another bungalow because the bungalows represented the character of the city, of this particular neighborhood, and they were staunchly opposed. And so there were many community meetings, and things were going poorly. We had one final meeting
in this church, and the place was packed with Douglas neighborhood people ready to bar us from tearing down the bungalow and putting up a religious education building. And the speeches were just, I mean, you know, devastating. Our chances were virtually nil. The chair of the committee, Priscilla Maid, and I just stole a gaze at each other, and we just kind of shook our heads, and it was not going to happen. Finally, the moderator said, "We have time for one more speaker." And the person who jumped up there was the Reverend Ed Wilson. Ed Wilson served this church from 1946 to 1949 and had returned to Salt Lake City, lived in Friendship Manor. Bless his heart, came over to the church to hear about this meeting. He began his roughly half-hour speech telling us awful stories that he had to suffer through when he lived in that house. Oh, how the Women's Alliance would come in and just take the cookies right off the kitchen table, and just went on and on, story after story. It was like it was leading to a crescendo. And after half an hour of stories, everybody sitting there was exhausted. He raised his cane. He was almost 90 years old, raised his cane, and he said, and I say, tear that damn thing down. People erupted in applause, voted, and we got to build the RE building. Thank you, Ed Wilson. Thank you so much. Let's quickly segue into announcements. Again, a reminder, next Sunday, do not come to church here, because there will be no church here. We're going to meet and celebrate big time the 125th anniversary of this church. It's going to be at the Marriott Dance Theater. Very special guests will be here. The jazz musicians will be here, the choir. It's going to be a wonderful, wonderful program. Be in on it, celebrate it. It'll be at 10:30 at Marriott Dance Theater at the University of Utah. Yeah, be sure to make that. If you want to come early, which I suggest, there will be an historic slideshow that will be shown starting at 10:10. The service starts at 10:30. We, as a congregation, can you imagine, over 125 years, have certainly known sorrow as well as celebrations. And it is in the spirit of great sadness that I wish to announce a memorial service next Saturday at 10:15 right here in this church. Judy Miller's daughter, Tess, passed away. She was only 41 years old. There will be a service here to celebrate her life, this church, 10:15 next Saturday. And also to make note of the beautiful flowers. They are given by the Grob family. And also these flowers just came in. These are from a dear friend of Barbara and Justin Kreek, a woman who lives in Japan, and they were friends because she was a teacher, and she just wanted to capture the spirit of Justin with some flowers. So we are blessed with a lot of flowers today in this church, which has known good times as well as some difficult times. The offering will now gratefully be received, a chance to greet one another and, hey, tell each other a story.
When I first entered this church, my hair was darker and quite a bit longer. Time has passed. I came too late to witness President William Howard Taft speak in this church. Or Langston Hughes, a wonderful poet. But I was able to hear the poet laureate of the United States, Mark Strand, come and speak here while teaching at the University of Utah, and Chase Peterson, the president of the University of Utah, and also Larry Miller, son of Laurel Miller, who was a longtime member of this church, and my friend Pat Bagley, the political cartoonist for the Tribune. Mark Maraboy, Native American, Navajo, drove up from San Juan County to speak about the issues concerning Native American people in this state. And my friend Ted Wilson, my boss 3 times, spoken in this church. J.D. Williams, a legend for 40 years as a professor at the University of Utah. 1999, August 4th, we had 6 candidates for mayor of Salt Lake City, right here. As you can imagine, the service went a little bit longer than usual that day. Perhaps the time that I remember that was so emotional was when the imam from the West Valley City Mosque spoke here in August 2002, just months after September 11th, 2001. That service went quite long, many questions. Summer Forum served as a place where we could talk out our problems rather than fight out our problems. It was so very important. Probably the most difficult time for me to speak in this church over 36 years was 2011, March 30th, when I stood up there and gave a eulogy for my friend Rule Eskelson, who had taken his own life. Married to Lily Eskelson, who joined this church in 1980, the same year that Kathy and I did. Lily lights up a room, and she lost her husband. It was very difficult that day. Perhaps the happiest times was really not so much Summer Forum as the impromptu, well-written comedy skits on contemporary issues that Alan Coombs, my department chair, chair of my committee, would write and did about Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush. I have to add Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, all of them providing excellent material for skits. And my hope is, as we look ahead to next year, that Alan, you may write another skit that I can participate in, maybe for President Hillary Clinton or President Bernie Sanders.
Thank you, Tim. Well, we have done some kind of interesting skits through the years, including one some of you may recall, a takeoff, a parody of Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, except Dorothy comes to the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City, and that role had to be played by Rebecca Heel. And when we first got together and ran through it, it became clear that we needed an accompanist, an accomplished pianist, and Becky, bless her heart, knew David Owens. So, as I say, it all fits together. But my second story, a fairly complicated one, involves Ron Clark, who was minister of this church from 1971 to 1976. You may see his picture in the hallway back there, which I've always thought of as the Rogues Gallery, and also a young Hugh Gillian. But Ron, as I say, was minister of this church and became, I think, a good friend, good enough that when we spent a year on the big island of Hawaii, my family, in 1977-78, Ron happened to be in the islands and came to visit and spend a night with us. And it was the next morning that he told me this complicated story. First, a little background. We had during that period a fellow named Ted Husbands, who acted as a kind of self-appointed greeter at the front door of the chapel. And if memory serves, Ted was a brother of Monroe Husbands, then a fairly high-ranking official at the UUA in Boston. But he was also, to use an old-fashioned term, peculiar. Not necessarily the kind of first impression you want to make on newcomers to the church, first-time visitors. Okay, back to Ron Clark. I think Ron would have admitted that while, he was a bright guy and had many good qualities as a minister, he was never known as a great pulpit orator. Maybe because, as I recall, his academic training was as an electrical engineer. But on one special Sunday, Ron had found a riveting topic, and everything was going right. The congregation was plugged in. He could look out and see all of the eyes trained on him, people savoring every word. But at that point in his career, Ron had also developed an affection for pipe smoking. Maybe because it made him appear more cerebral or something of the sort, but he would always carry this pipe around with him. And Ted Husbands hated it, hated the pipe, hated Ron for smoking it. Okay, back to the special Sunday sermon where everything was going right. Ron was building to a stirring climax when the glass doors at the rear of the chapel swung open. Ted Husbands leaned in and proclaimed in a loud voice, "Asshole." I think that's the story Tom wanted me to share with you because it's every minister's worst nightmare.
Well, it is always a challenge to follow Alan in any presentation. And I do recognize that my early comments really were quite dreary, but I think it's important for you to know what this church community had to struggle with as best it could through that decade. So on the happier side of the ledger regarding the 60s, let me just mention some things that were happening on a positive note. For instance, in the country, the civil rights movement finally prompted President Johnson to push for and sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And there were other progressive features in that act. Slowly and not without great resistance in some parts, important first steps were accomplished in protecting the civil rights of most Americans. I say most because one group of citizens were not included fully then, and that was the LGBTQ community. But by the late 60s, even that community was beginning to find solidarity in fledgling organizations and informal associations. Needless to say, all these years later, there is still work to be done to guarantee full rights for persons of all sexual orientations. Another very large group of American citizens finding hope and inspiration in the 60s was comprised of American females. What came to be known as women's lib was given great impetus by a widely read book by Betty Friedan entitled The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963. Many women have credited that book with a new personal awareness and exciting marching orders personally and collectively. There were good things happening right here in our own church during the tumultuous 60s. The local branch of the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, the Community Cooperative Nursery School, and the Salt Lake Acting Company all had their beginnings in this church. We even had a little credit union for Unitarian ministers. That was handy. In my remaining time now, quickly, I want to tell you about this building that looms over this block, Friendship Manor. In 1961, Dr. Robert Conrad, who was a retired economics professor at Westminster, buttonholed me in the parking lot, and he said, "Hugh, there's federal money available for senior citizen housing. through the Department of Health and Human, again, Housing and Urban Development. Thank you. And he said, I think the Unitarian Church should sponsor such a project. Well, that was a bold idea, but I was intrigued, and I said, I think we need to take this proposal to the board of the church and see what they say. We did. The board considered it, decided to form a small committee and to further explore the issues. And when that small committee got together, it became immediately obvious that we needed a broader base of support to create any such venture. So we invited the leadership of the Jewish congregation, First United Church of Christ, the United Church of Christ, First Congregational Church. I'm scrambling this terribly. In any event, there were now 4 religious organizations, each of which contributed 3 members to a Friendship Manor board. And so that group met. We had to think about lawyers, accountants, architects. For the minutes of our board meetings, we passed the hat because we didn't really have much money in the treasury. We never had more than $200 in the treasury. And we had to pay a Kelly girl, no such person today, I'm sure, a Kelly girl to come and take the minutes. And that was how we kept the formal records. Well, then, now to make this story short, there it stands, a $5 million building, and we can justly be proud of our role in that process. Coincidentally, this past week, I had occasion to talk with Bill Conrad, Dr. Conrad's son, and I told him if it had not been for your father, there would never have been a Friendship Manor. And I think that's true. Thank you.
In the war years of the 40s, this Unitarian Church was a place of refuge, of social outreach, and community action. As young men went off to war and women took to the workplace, Elliott Hall in the classrooms became a nursery school for working mothers. Today, we see how this start has grown into the CCNS preschool, housed today in our RE building during the weekdays. We welcomed into our membership a Jewish family that had escaped from Hitler's Germany. We raised funds to help our allies, the Russians, showing Russian war films, dark and tragic, with scenes of soldiers struggling on the snowy banks of the Volga River, and even the birth of a baby in a shack on the wintry plains, something unheard of in American films. Later, we hosted a Russian family, and I loved babysitting Dmitri, their 8-year-old, while trying to pronounce his Russian words. Our new minister, Raymond Cope, had a special interest in young people. He took a young teen under his wing, acting as a kind of father figure for him when his alcoholic father abused him. He even took him with the Cope family on vacation to Idaho for a hunting and fishing trip. Now, camping was one of the few ways that you could get away, as gasoline was rationed. The junior high group, under the guidance of Dr. Cope and his wife, created their own sleeping bags from heavy canvas and flannel linings that we quilted over cotton batting on Mrs. Cope's heavy-duty sewing machine. We were so proud of our clumsy vacations, clumsy creations, and I insisted on taking it with me when we went on camping trips, even though we had to drag it along because it was so heavy. Now, Nazis and Japs were the enemy in those days, and with a heightened patriotism, I felt cleanly the rejection by my school classmates who mocked my mother's German accent, calling me Babaha in imitation. I felt a special kinship for the very few Japanese American students who could not escape rejection and harsh words wherever they went. I was thrilled when our junior high class was offered a chance to be pen pals with Nisi teens in a camp near Delta, Utah. We knew that Japanese families had left California's Pacific coast as a war effort, but we didn't learn until much later how cruel that government action was. Anna Horia became my pen pal. We wrote to one another about typical teenage things, school classes, teachers, girlfriends. Anna sent me her picture, a stocky, dark-haired girl standing on the steps of a wooden porch. I thought her letters were sweet and rather bland. Only much later did I learn how terrible the experiences that our Japanese American families went through, how harsh life was in the relocation camps, how all the letters were inspected, maybe even redacted or confiscated, and how terrible Anna must have had to be, how careful Anna must have had to be to write only silly, girly things, never hinting at the terrible suffering her family went through at the Topaz camp. I'm proud that our First Unitarian Church were the only ones who reached out to an innocent group so ostracized by their own government.
Just want to make a brief comment which will serve as our closing words because it says a lot about the character of this congregation. Quickly, it was on a Tuesday in 1999, very innocent morning, opened up the Salt Lake Tribune. Headline was Salt Lake Tribune. The headline was LDS Church buys Main Street for $8.1 million. And I just kind of unraveled, and let me tell you, the phone never stopped ringing, the office. I mean, it was pretty upsetting. And although I had a very wonderful sermon planned for the upcoming Sunday, I knew that nobody would pay an ounce of attention because the focus was on Main Street. And so I quickly reshuffled the deck and invited a member of our church, Dick Aaron, who was teaching constitutional law at the University of Utah Law School, Steve Clark, who was the litigator for the ACLU, and Steve Epperson, who was formerly the historian of the LDS Church, and also had taught at BYU, but he was attending this church. And so I moderated them, and the three of them spoke. The constitutional lawyer said, oh, no, it's legal, you can do it. And the ACLU lawyer said, I don't know if this is legal. We're going to try to challenge it. And we learned about the history of Main Street, which was, Brigham Young had every intention of keeping it as a commercial street. This would be very important for the growth of Salt Lake City. What happened was that a couple of weeks later, Steve Clark of the ACLU gave me a call and said, we want to file a lawsuit against the LDS Church, with the First Unitarian Church considered being the chief plaintiff in the case. And it's, the way our governance is run, I couldn't make that decision. The board couldn't make that decision. And so we had a very emotional congregational meeting. And everything was laid out. ACLU was here. Danny Iyer, the director of the ACLU, Steve Clark was here. We talked. But then when the congregation responded, it really was a very heartfelt concern and pain because obviously we live here in Salt Lake City, and many of our neighbors are LDS, and how would that reflect upon members of the church if our church sued? People going to work, many of their colleagues were Mormons, and how would that, the good relationships, there were really good feelings all around. What do we really want to upset the apple cart? But after a lengthy congregational meeting in which we just went over the constitutional grounds by which we felt an obligation and commitment to do this, the congregation voted unanimously to pursue the case and that we would become the lead plaintiff in the case. We lost the first round in the federal court, then moved up to the appellate court. We won the appellate court. And then it took until 2002, June of 2002, that the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear the case, and so it was a victory for the ACLU and we as the plaintiff. ACLU received $200,000 in legal fees from the LDS Church. Some time passed, and Mayor Rocky Anderson, for whatever reason, another whole story, gave the easement of the temple grounds to the LDS Church in exchange for a couple of acres on the west side in which the Sorensen Center was now built. So it really does have a good ending. And, but I was exceptionally proud of this congregation that really wrestled with a deeply emotional issue. Also in that time, I was contacted by 3 LDS bishops in a very supportive way, saying that we know this is not an anti-LDS sentiment as part of the Unitarians. We know this is strictly a constitutional matter, and you have our support. And that really lifted my spirits and really helped during this very, very difficult time period. Let me just end by saying one last thing. Probably many of you read in the Salt Lake Tribune today that sometime in March, was the 20th, that the Republican debate is going to be held in Salt Lake City, right? But it didn't say where. And so since Tim Chambless has gotten some remarkable people here into this church, I want to ask Tim to make sure that we can get the Republican debate right here in this church next month. Thank you, Tim.